The next approach to the philosophy of mind we'll look at is called behaviorism. Once upon a time, the late 19th century to be a little bit more precise, researchers who were trying to establish psychology as a genuine science used introspection as an important source of data. To introspect is literally to look inward. These researchers used people's judgments about what was going on in their conscious experience to test various hypotheses about the mind and how it works. For example, they were interested in questions like, how much do physical stimuli have to differ for the experiences of them to be noticeably different? How weak can a stimulus be but still be consciously perceived? What is the mathematical relationship between stimulus strength and the strength of the sensation it causes? And they thought the best way to get answers to these questions was to ask people to tell them about their conscious experiences while they were having them in carefully controlled experimental conditions. According to William James, in doing psychology, quote, introspective observation is what we have to rely on first and foremost and always, unquote. But there were problems. The main one being that when people disagreed in their introspective judgments, there didn't seem to be a way to determine who, if anyone, was right. When there's a disagreement in an objective observational science like chemistry, a third party can compare samples or results and perform experiments to determine who is right. But we can't do this in the case of conscious experience, because we can't send two experiences off to another lab for comparison. The experiences are not, as Nagel stressed, objective entities like elements. One important controversy in introspective psychology concerned whether there is a special experience of thinking or whether all conscious experience consists of only sensory images. This guy said he introspected thought experience. This guy said he didn't introspect thought experience. How could it be determined who is right? There didn't seem to be a way to get a definitive answer to this question, or a resolution to any conflicts over what's in consciousness based on introspection alone. This is a methodological problem. That is, a problem about the methodology of experimental psychology. What methods should we use? What procedures, experiments, sources of data, etc., will give us definitive answers to questions about the mind? Many came to believe that psychology must be based on empirical methodology if it was to be a genuine science. That is, psychologists needed to study phenomena that are equally accessible to more than one individual. At the beginning of the 20th century, psychologists began to think that the study of the mind should be focused on the study of behavior. Behavior is empirically observable and can be studied using empirical scientific methods. The idea was that we could get at the phenomena of conscious experience in an indirect way through the empirical study of behavior and its causes, and that this might provide an objective, genuinely scientific methodology for studying subjective mental reality. For example, we might try to determine the intensity of an experience of pain by comparing stimuli, such as pinching, poking, or burning, with responses, such as how loud the subject yells, how the body recoils from the stimulus, how far the subject will go to avoid the stimulus, etc. This way, we wouldn't have to rely on experimental subjects' introspective judgments about their subjective experiences. If it turns out that everybody, or almost everybody, reacts more violently to burning than to pinching, for example, we could conclude that burning pain is worse than pinching pain. And we could compare responses to varying intensity and duration of a particular kind of stimulus, for example heat, and reach conclusions about the mathematical relationship between stimulus strength and sensation strength. And we could use such observations to help us try to resolve disputes arising from introspection and reach objective, testable theories about the nature of conscious experience. Some went so far as to say that data for a science of the mind could only come from observation of the relationships between stimuli and responses. They completely rejected any introspective methodology. This approach to psychology is called methodological behaviorism. It claimed that introspection is scientifically useless and that all psychology can study is behavior and its causes. Other psychologists went even further than this. They claimed not only that scientific psychology should be restricted to the study of behavior and its causes, but that behavior and its causes is all there is to human psychology. That is, they claim that to be in a psychological state is not to be in a subjective state of consciousness, but instead to be behaving in a particular way in particular circumstances, or at least to have a tendency to behave in a particular way in particular circumstances. So, for example, to be in pain is not to be in a conscious state with a particular kind of phenomenology. It is instead to wince, cry out, run away, etc., when pinched, poked, or burned, etc. This kind of behaviorism claims that all there is to being in a psychological state is exhibiting certain behaviors in certain circumstances. This is what psychological states are. Philosophers call this version of behaviorism ontological behaviorism. Ontology is the study of what there is. For example, the question of whether or not there are souls is an ontological question. Do souls exist? Ontological behaviorism claims that all there is to having a mind is behaving in certain ways in certain circumstances. There is no such thing as inner conscious subjective experience. You might think that this is really implausible. Isn't it obvious to each of us that we have conscious subjective experience? Maybe it can't be studied scientifically, but that doesn't mean it doesn't exist. If you think this, I agree with you. Behaviorism was a really bad idea. It's hard to understand how anyone who actually has a mind could have believed it. But things got even weirder when philosophers got a hold of the idea. In 1949, the English philosopher Gilbert Ryle published a book called The Concept of Mind. In this book, Ryle attacked Descartes' dualistic conception of the mind and the body. He argued that Descartes' idea of mind-body duality is not just false, it doesn't even make sense. Ryle thought that in thinking of the mind as a kind of object, Descartes was deeply confused. He ridiculed Descartes' view as positing a ghost in the machine being the body. Ryle claimed that in treating the mind as an object, or a substance, to use Descartes' term, Descartes made what he calls a category mistake. The category mistake is made when a thing of one kind is said to have characteristics that only things of some other kind can have. For example, this product claims that its number one ingredient is quality. But quality isn't an ingredient. It's not like Nutricote holistic kibble or buffalo. To call quality an ingredient is to put it in the wrong category. Quality is not a kind of thing that could be an ingredient. It's a property of ingredients. Here's another category mistake. Boston has 6 letters. Boston is a city. Cities aren't kinds of things that could have letters. Only words have letters, and Boston isn't a word. Here's a version of one of Ryle's own examples. Suppose a prospective student who is touring Cal State LA and is shown the library, the student center, the engineering building, etc., asks, which building is the university? The prospective student has made a category mistake in thinking that a university is the same kind of thing as a library, a student center, an engineering building, etc. A university is not a building. According to Ryle, Descartes' category mistake is thinking that the mind is an object. And this leads to thinking that the mind must be an immaterial object, since it seems to have very different properties from ordinary material objects. When Descartes says that the mind is an immaterial object, he's saying that it's the same general kind of thing as a material object, only it's not made of matter. Ryle thinks this is absurd. It's like saying quality is an ingredient, the same general kind of thing as kibble and buffalo, only it's not a physical ingredient. Quality isn't an ingredient at all. It's a property of ingredients. Likewise, Ryle argues, the mind isn't a thing at all. Mental properties are just behavioral properties of the body. Ryle thinks furthermore that Descartes' metaphysical mistake rests on a logical mistake. It derives from thinking that since the expression the body and the expression the mind are expressions of the same linguistic kind, they have the same logical function. The expression the body is what's called a definite description. It's a description because body is a descriptive word. It's a definite description because it begins with a definite article, the. The logical function of the expression the body is to pick out or refer to some particular thing. It has the same logical function as the first woman in space, which picks out or refers to Valentina Tereshkova, a particular individual. But not every expression of this form has the logical function of picking out or referring to a specific individual thing. And if we assume that all definite descriptions have this logical function, we'll be led to make mistakes in our ontology. For example, if we think that the description the average American has this function, we'll be led to think that it refers to a unique individual. And if we think that, we'll end up having to say things like, the average American has an income, an age, a height, and a weight, but not a gender or an address or a hair or eye color. And this could lead us to the absurd conclusion that the average American is some kind of indeterminate being, not entirely a person, though sharing some attributes with persons, or that some couples have 2.5 children. Ryle would tell us that we've been led to these absurd conclusions because we fail to recognize that the expression the average American doesn't work in the same way logically as the expression the first woman in space. It's not supposed to stand for a unique individual. The way to avoid these absurdities is to realize that saying anything about the average American is just shorthand for saying something about Americans on average. Any sentence containing the expression the average American can be translated into a sentence that doesn't contain this expression, but says something about Americans on average. To say that the average American couple has 2.5 children, for example, is not to say that there is a couple, the average American couple, and they have 2.5 children. It's to say that the average of the number of children that American couples have is 2.5. That is, if you divide the number of American couples by the number of American children, the result is the number 2.5. And to say that the average American is 5 feet 8 inches tall is just to say that, on average, the height of Americans is 5 feet 8 inches. And this doesn't entail that anyone actually is that height, though, of course, plenty of people are. Just as it doesn't follow from the fact that the average number of children per couple is 2.5 that some couple has 2.5 children. So the sentence, the average American family has 2.5 children, means the same as the sentence, the average of the number of children that American families have is 2.5. The second sentence doesn't commit us to the existence of a family that is the average American family. Where do they live? And it doesn't commit us to the possibility of fractional children. How could they survive? So since the first sentence means exactly the same thing, it doesn't commit us to the existence of these things either. We only get into trouble if we take sentences like the average American family has 2.5 children at face value. But we don't have to, since these sentences are just convenient ways of saying something else. Likewise, says Ryle, if we think the mind has the same logical function as the body, because these expressions have the same grammatical or linguistic form, we'll be led to say absurd things like, the mind is an object that doesn't exist in space. The mind has properties that no physical thing could possibly have. Or the mind and the body can't possibly interact with each other. Ryle says that this mistake commits Descartes to the absurd claim that the mind is a thing, but not a physical thing. He says that according to Descartes, the body is a bit of clockwork, while the mind is a bit of not clockwork. Here's an instructive joke. Sam says to Abe, "Say, Abe, can you explain to me how landlines work? I don't get it." Abe says, "Sure, it's like this. Imagine you've got this gigantic dog. It's so big, it can stand in Manhattan with its head in Brooklyn and its tail in the Bronx." Sam says, "Oh, okay." Abe, "So when you talk to the head in Brooklyn, the tail wags in the Bronx." Sam says, "Ah, I see now. Very nice. But what about cell phones? Can you explain to me how they work?" Abe says, "Simple. It's the same thing, only you don't have the dog." The joke is funny because it's absurd. It's absurd because if you don't have the dog, you can't possibly have the same thing. Ryle accuses Descartes of thinking that the mind is the same kind of thing as the body, only without the matter. But this is clearly impossible. Just as we can avoid absurdities about the average American if we understand that any sentence containing the term "the average American" means the same as, and can be replaced by, some sentence that doesn't contain that term, we can, Ryle says, avoid Descartes' absurdity if we understand that any sentence containing the term "the mind" means the same as, and can be replaced by, some sentence that doesn't contain that term. Furthermore, any sentence that presupposes that the mind is a thing, or attributes some characteristic to the mind as a thing, even if it doesn't contain the term "the mind," means the same as, and can be replaced by, another sentence that does not make this presupposition or any such attribution. But which sentences should we replace sentences that presuppose that the mind is a thing with? How do we translate, for example, "John has a beautiful mind," or "Wanda has a quick wit," in a way that doesn't commit us to John's mind or Wanda's wit, which are both mental things? Ryle claims that when we use psychological terms, what we're referring to is people's behaviors and dispositions or tendencies to behave in certain ways in particular circumstances. What we mean by the word nausea, for example, is some set of characteristic observable behaviors. For example, making certain faces, throwing up, avoiding food, etc. These kinds of behaviors are evidence that someone is nauseated. For Ryle, they are what we mean when we say that someone is nauseated. The term happy, for another example, refers to a different range of characteristic behaviors. When we say someone is happy, we mean that they're behaving or have a tendency to behave in certain characteristic ways. Ryle thinks that all psychological terms have behavioral meanings because of the way we learn them. Since we can't access anyone else's inner experience, we can only learn the meaning of psychological terminology by observing people's behaviors in different circumstances, and then being told which terms to use to characterize them. Moreover, if all psychological terms have behavioral meanings, it should always be possible to translate a sentence containing psychological terms into a sentence containing only behavioral terms without any loss of meaning. This view, which claims that psychological terms have behavioral meanings, is called logical behaviorism. It's also called analytic behaviorism because it claims that psychological language can be analyzed or defined in behavioral terms. What it means to say that someone is happy, according to this view, is that they are behaving or are disposed to behave in certain ways in certain circumstances. Because of this, we don't have to take psychological language at face value, and we will not be led into dualistic absurdities. We avoid immaterial minds in the same way we avoid fractional children and individuals with no hair or eye color. Now, aside from the fact that Ryle's theory completely ignores the subjective point of view, that is, what it's like for an individual to be in a mental state, it has two serious internal problems. The first is that it seems obvious that an individual could be in a particular mental state, pain or nausea, say, and not exhibit any behavior at all. Or that a person could exhibit all the characteristic behaviors of these states without actually being in pain or nauseated. But if this is possible, then it can't be that to say that someone is in pain or happy or nauseated is the same thing as saying that they're behaving in certain ways. The second problem concerns Ryle's claim that any psychological sentence can be completely translated into a behavioral sentence. If you actually try to do this, it becomes clear that psychological terminology can never be completely eliminated. Suppose we try to translate the sentence, "Caroline is nauseated," into a sentence containing only behavioral terminology. If the translation is accurate, if the sentences have exactly the same meaning, the translation will have to be true whenever the original is true. In general, if two sentences have the same meaning, then it isn't possible for one to be true while the other is not true. So, for example, if snow is white is an accurate translation of La nieve es blanca, then it can't be that La nieve es blanca is true, but snow is white is not true. Now, suppose we translate Caroline is nauseated as Caroline is making a face, avoiding food, and will soon throw up. It's easy to imagine a situation in which, though the first sentence N is true, the behavioral analysis of it, B, is false. Suppose Caroline really hates throwing up and will do anything to avoid it. If this is true, then she may be feeling nauseated but never throw up. So it can be true that Caroline is nauseated, but false that she's making a face, avoiding food, and will soon throw up. Therefore, the behavioral sentence and our original sentence, Caroline is nauseated, can't have the same meaning. Now, we might try to fix things up by adopting a different translation. For example, B star, Caroline is making a face, avoiding food, and will soon throw up unless she really hates throwing up and will do anything to avoid it. But notice that while this second sentence, B star, may be true whenever the original one is true, B star contains the term hates, which is psychological. So we haven't given a purely behavioristic analysis of our original sentence, N. And if we try to patch this up by giving a behavioral analysis of the term hate, we'll run into the same problem. We'll have to introduce psychological terminology to make the behavioral translation true when and only when the psychological sentence is true. And it turns out that, in fact, it isn't possible to give an analysis of our original sentence N or any other psychological sentence in exclusively behavioral terms. Psychological terms will keep popping up, and any attempt to eliminate them will introduce yet more psychological terms. The reason for this is that there is no direct connection between any given psychological state and behavior. It's just not true that being in psychological state P will always cause someone to exhibit some specific behavior B. What behaviors you exhibit when you're in state P will always depend upon what other psychological states you're in. So it's not possible to give a purely behavioral sentence that's true when and only when a psychological sentence is true. So, logical behaviorism is a false theory. Psychological terminology can't be completely eliminated. And notice that the very same considerations also show that ontological behaviorism is a false theory. A psychological state P can't just be a stimulus-response pair, since which stimulus is paired with which response depends on what psychological state an individual is in. We can't analyze psychological states as stimulus-response pairs because there are no stimulus-response pairs without psychological states. We may accept that in order to be a real science, psychology must adopt empirical observational methodology. But we can't do psychology without recognizing that internal conscious states of individuals, however difficult they may be to discern or measure, are genuinely psychological. The next attempt to avoid the problems of mind-body dualism that we'll look at allows that psychological states are internal states of individuals, but it characterizes them in such a way that conscious experiences are, once again, not accounted for.